Alright guys, Murph's here, and today we're going to talk about 20 gauge and its versatility and capabilities. And Peppercorn's going to come say hi. Hi Brad. Come on, I'm doing something right now. Alright? Chill out. Alright, so, a lot of times whenever you bring up 20 gauge and you happen to be an adult, there's a lot of people who kind of sneer at you. It's happened to me before. I've been shooting 20 gauge since I was a kid. I still have several 20 gauge shotguns, and I enjoy taking them out on the range. They're very enjoyable guns to shoot. There is nothing macho related about shooting in general. Like, we need to divorce our egos from it to begin with. But especially when it comes to using a 20 gauge shotgun, because there's quite a few excellent aspects about 20 gauge that we are going to talk about today, as well as some negatives, and we'll get into it. This is a very much so conceptual discussion about how and when 20 gauge applies. Now, rolling right into it, right off the bat, 20 gauge is excellent for very young men, or very young people, I should say, and very old people. Let's go ahead and let's start out with the young people first. So, right off the bat, 20 gauge in general is a lightweight shotgun and is a light recoiling round even in a lightweight shotgun. Now you can get a lightweight enough shotgun in 20 gauge in order to actually cause you some discomfort, but it is much easier to do in a lightweight 12 gauge than it is in a lightweight 20 gauge. Case in point, this gun right here is 5.8 pounds, 20 gauge semi-automatic high standard Supermatic trap, which I actually just previously reviewed not that long ago. 5.8 pounds. That is incredibly light. A 5.8 pound 12 gauge, especially with hunting loads or something like that, could actually cause you quite a bit of discomfort, whereas that shotgun is an absolute pleasure to shoot. So, with that being the case, that really starts to make a 20 gauge a savvy decision, especially if you start to talk about a youth length shotgun. Now, guys, when we're talking about teaching the youth how to shoot, we need to not cut corners. And when I say that, I mean you wouldn't necessarily try to majorly oversize your child's pants just so you wouldn't have to buy pants as much. I know parents out there who definitely try to get a size or two bigger. Maybe there's a little bit of bunching around the waist whenever they tighten a belt on them or something like that. But you wouldn't try to do anything extreme to where the pants or the clothing in general just wasn't fitting them right, because they'll grow into it. You should not be doing the same thing with the length of stock on a shotgun. If the shotgun stock is too long, it's going to cause them discomfort, it's going to cause them pain, and it's going to cause them to develop bad habits whenever they shoot. That is why youth length shotguns are important. Even if that means that they're going to eventually outgrow the shotgun, oh well. Trade it off to somebody else for something new, sell it, or pop a new, longer stock on it. That'll be fine as well. What is more important, especially when we're talking about introducing new shooters, regardless of their age, is that they have the properly sized gun for what it is that you're trying to do. If it's too big, it's not going to help. If it's too small, it's not going to help. That's where 20 gauge is really fantastic, because there's a ton of youth length 20 gauges, and there's a ton of light youth length 20 gauges that, again, with 20 gauge, do not cause too much recoil and are actually quite pleasurable to shoot. And that's going to be very important when we're talking about that young person learning how to shoot well. I am somebody that, specifically with handguns, never really learned how to shoot properly as a kid, so I had to figure that out as an adult. And it took me a really long time because, of course, when I was 18, 19, 20 years old, I knew everything, so there was no way you had anything to teach me. Now, I have since learned my lesson, and I've definitely realized that I had a lot of bad habits I had to untrain. I've been spending a lot of time untraining those bad habits. Don't set somebody else up for failure like that, because they're going to spend a lot of time changing it, or they won't, and they're actually going to possibly cause more harm than good. Now, some guys might say, well, that's why I started my kit off with a 410. Well, that is a method, but I'm not necessarily convinced that that is the best method, and I'll tell you why. 410 is a very short-range shotgun. And when you're trying to get somebody to apply a lot of the basics and fundamentals like safety and then proper placement in the shoulder, and then getting their face down along the bore and leading the target and all that kind of stuff, that clay pigeon might just be out of range by the time they squeeze off that shot on a 410. That's actually why quite often 410s are considered to be an expert shotgun, because they are used by people who are looking for a challenge, who are looking for something that's a little bit more difficult. They have to be a little faster on the target in order to be able to properly hit it. Now, 20 gauge, on the other hand, can still come in very light, can still come in properly sized for a youth, and has greater range than a 410. So after they make sure they go through all their proper basics and fundamentals, they may still make a proper hit. And the best thing about trap and steel shooting is that it gives that instantaneous gratification. And that is huge when you're talking about a training tool. You know, going down and being able to look at really properly placed holes and being able to tell somebody, well, this is where your shot group's at, this is the adjustments that you need to make so that you can refine them as a shooter in that way, is very important. But when you're talking about gratification, about just getting them on at the target to begin with, and then really stressing those basics into the advanced later on, that's kind of how that continuum should work. And dusting a clay pigeon is going to enforce proper practice more so than neat little holes in paper and stuff like that. Just to throw that out there, just to keep that in mind. That's a very important aspect of training, especially when you're trying to get somebody captured into what it is that you're doing. Now, let's go ahead and look at the older person aspect of it. Many years ago, while on a hunt with my uncle, he took a nasty spill in a ravine and he jacked up his back pretty badly. And he found shortly thereafter that he was having a lot of trouble carrying a 12 gauge pump shotgun. At that time he was carrying a BPS. And he found a lot of times that heavier shotguns they wore on him longer over the day. And they really kind of diminished his battery life, so to speak, on a hunt. So after that, he went to a 20 gauge over-under shotgun in about the 6.5 pound range. And he found that he was able to stay more invested in a hunt for a longer period of time. Now, something just as a little aside about shotgun manufacture and production is that let's call it the 1980s, most shotguns were built on actual frames associated in their caliber or gauge. So 12 gauge guns were built on 12 gauge frames. 20 gauge guns were built on 20 gauge frames. 410s were built on 410 frames. Now, post the 1980s, you started to see a lot less of that, to where pretty much it only comes down to you have 10 gauge frames, 12 gauge frames, and 410 frames. Now, a 20 gauge shotgun still doesn't need as much, or does not require the same dimensions as a 12 gauge. A 20 gauge does not need a 20 gauge barrel or anything like that. So in a lot of little ways, 20 gauge shotguns in current production cut some weight, and then also a lot of like weight saving cuts will be thrown in there because they don't need as much weight. But generally, a 20 gauge shotgun is still more or less built on a 12 gauge frame and will still be heavier than what a comparable gun built in, say, the 1960s would be. It's going to be very difficult for a 20 gauge shotgun that's not purpose built to be a 20 gauge shotgun to be in the 5.8 pound range like that High Standard Supermatic trap shotgun that I showed you earlier. So, just to throw that out there as a consideration, whatever it is that you're looking at shotguns on the current market. Now, let's go ahead and take this kind of lightweight process and let's talk about it in the competitive shooting circle. Now, most of the time what people will tell you in competitive shooting is that actually a heavier shotgun is more beneficial to you because you're going to be shooting a lot of shells out of it and you're going to be withstanding a lot of recoil, and heavier guns soak up recoil better. Now, also keep in mind that in shotgun competitive shooting, you're generally talking about trap, skeet, and 5-stand. Now, in two of those, you're pretty much in the same static location, trap and 5-stand specifically, where you're going to walk up to the shooting position and then walk back to a bench, and then walk up to the shooting position and then walk back to the bench. So you're not exactly walking over hill and dale with your shotgun at that point. Now, In skeet shooting, you wind up going from a golf cart to a shooting stand back to the golf cart. So really, it's just louder golf in that case, in most places that you go and you see skeet ranges and stuff like that. So really, there's not a lot of emphasis to have a lightweight competition shotgun unless you're looking for something that tracks more quickly across multiple targets and stuff like that. That's really the only purpose for it. However, now let's take that same concept and apply it to hunting. Now, hunting, when you are potentially walking over hill and dale and all that kind of stuff, a lighter shotgun might be more beneficial to you, and specifically a lighter 20 gauge, because a lighter 20 gauge, you'll still be able to run fairly potent loads out of it and not have as much recoil as you would out of a 12 gauge. Now, the important thing about hunting is that it's hunting and not killing. So in most cases, you're not really shooting that many shells, so you may not be as concerned about recoil as much as you are concerned about having to maintain your stamina over a day's worth of walking all over the place, especially if you're hunting something like grouse, where you might be going through some pretty heavy brush and stuff like that. Now, let's just go ahead and continue on down our hunting thread here, and I want to talk about 20 gauge's applicability to hunting different types of game, with the overall thought here being that we maintain ethical and humane kills on game animals. This is very important. This is actually worthy of an entire video, the ethical, humane killing of animals in hunting type situations. That actually deserves its own video, but that is the thought that we need to keep in mind right now. So, when it comes to rabbits and squirrels, I think 20 gauge is a fantastic choice right off the bat. It's great. Absolutely great. Then when we get into quail, snipe, woodcock, and dove, 20 gauge with the proper loads and proper distances being taken into account is a fantastic choice. When we start to talk about Hungarian partridge or chucker, maybe grouse and pheasant, now we really need to put an emphasis on the proper load and distance, because along with dove, these birds actually have very thick plumage, and it might take a lot to be able to get through them. I've seen a lot of guys think that they hit doves and see them fall, only for them to recover just before they hit the ground, because it turns out they didn't actually penetrate all the feathers, especially when it comes to using 20 gauge. So that's something that definitely needs to be thought about. A heavier shot might be required when you're taking these birds, as well as closer shots. Now, ducks. I am completely fine with using 20 gauge to hunt ducks as long as you're taking very short 2 3/4 inch shells, perhaps with a youth hunter. Or if you're using 3-inch shells, if you're a little bit older and you're trying to take further shots, or if you're a little better resistant to recoil and you're trying to take further shots. Now, geese, I am not okay with hunting with 20 gauge on pass shooting unless you have a really good decoy setup and you're springing up from cover to be able to take them at very close range. Then that makes sense to me. Now, for turkeys, I would still prefer to see 3-inch shells used, even with youth, purely because I think that's a more successful turkey cartridge. But to each their own, just make sure that you're, again, utilizing the proper shot size and distances. Now, let's go ahead and take this concept over into buckshot for hunting in 20 gauge. I have hunted with buckshot, but I've never taken any game with buckshot. And for 20 gauge, I start to feel like that's a little too few shot to attempt to use. Now, maybe if I was trying to take something with me on, let's say in Alaska, on a fishing trip, and I was concerned that maybe I might have to take on some grizz who really wanted my salmon or thought that I was a really delicious snack, then perhaps something lightweight like a 20 gauge with some buckshot in it would still be effective. But I really start to feel like 20 gauge buckshot against a grizzly bear is marginally effective. Now, if we switch the topic over to self-defense, 20 gauge buckshot is actually extremely savvy, especially if you start to talk about number 4 buckshot and how it doesn't necessarily overpenetrate through drywall in home defense type situations. Now, don't just take my word for it. There's actually a lot of articles out on this subject and quite a few YouTube videos. I would actually recommend Paul Harrells, who does an absolutely excellent video on 20 gauge overpenetration through drywall. He does a comparison across a bunch of different calibers. I highly recommend it. Sometimes he's a little dry, but he puts out fantastic information. I highly recommend his videos. Now, let's talk about slugs. Now, when we're talking about self-defense type scenarios and slugs in 2 3/4 inch shells, I find out to 100 yards that's perfectly acceptable for man-sized targets. However, if we switch that over to the topic of hunting, I would still prefer to see 3-inch 20 gauge shells be used in hunting game animals, purely from an ethical and humane kill standpoint. That's just my opinion. If you're completely comfortable with taking shorter shots, then 2 3/4 inch shells make sense to me. But or if you're trying to scale it appropriately to the hunter, just make sure that that youth hunter that you're giving to, that youth or older hunter that you're giving 2 3/4 inch shells to, is taking shots at the appropriate range for those shells. A wounded game animal, causing any game animal unnecessary pain, just doesn't make sense to me. Now, in addition to home defense scenarios with 20 gauge shotguns, little caveat, little add-on that I want to throw into there. The great thing about 20 gauge shotguns is that everybody from little Timmy to Grandma Edna can probably handle that 20 gauge shotgun, especially if you pair the cartridge to the family member and the scenario. So I'm still a big fan of, in extremely close range home defense scenarios, using birdshot because it will not overpenetrate and because it is lighter recoiling. So that would make it extremely beneficial to a recoil sensitive family member. I'm just throwing that out there. And I have talked about this in other videos. Specifically, I have a 3-part series, but not really a 3-part series, on home defense shotguns, and I'll definitely roll that into the description so that you guys can check those out if you find those interesting. However, I think that pretty much wraps up my thoughts on 20 gauge for right now. So, until next time, I guess have a good day.